On the morning of the 10th of January 1991, on a low hill in Texas that the locals called Spindletop, a drilling crew was having a bad day. They had been at it for months. The men were tired, the money was nearly gone, and the whole enterprise was widely considered a joke. A hill in the middle of nowhere, drilled by a mechanic with a theory nobody believed. At around 10 in the morning, mud began to bubble out of the hole. Then the drill pipe came out. Not lifted out, fired out. 6 tons of steel launched into the sky like a spear, tearing through the top of the derrick. There was a silence, and then a roar, and then the earth opened up and threw a column of black oil 150 feet into the air. It did not stop. It ran for 9 days. That single well produced 100,000 barrels a day, more than every other oil well in the United States combined, more than every oil well on earth had produced in a day, ever. Men stood in the black rain and could not speak. Within a year, the town beside that hill went from 10,000 people to 50,000. Land that had sold for $10 an acre sold for $900,000. 6 of the largest companies in the world today can trace their bloodline to that hill. And here is the strange part of the story. Nobody standing in that black rain understood what they were looking at. They thought they had found a very large deposit of lamp fuel. They had found the thing that would decide who won the next 2 world wars, who would be rich and who would be poor for the next century, what the air would be made of, and how far a human being could reasonably expect to travel in a lifetime. This is the history of oil. Start with the substance itself, because it is stranger than it looks. Oil is not the remains of dinosaurs. That is a piece of folklore invented largely by a petrol company's advertising department. Oil is mostly plankton, microscopic algae and bacteria that lived and died in ancient seas, drifting down into the mud in unimaginable numbers over unimaginable time. Bury that mud deep enough and something remarkable happens. Under a few kilometers of rock, at somewhere between 60 and 120 degrees, the dead plankton is slowly cooked. Not burnt, cooked gently for millions of years, until its molecules break down and rearrange into chains of hydrogen and carbon. Geologists call that zone the oil window. Too shallow? Too deep, and the heat cracks everything into gas. The world's entire supply of oil exists because certain patches of seabed happen to be buried to exactly the right depth and then were capped by exactly the right kind of impermeable rock, and then sat there undisturbed for tens of millions of years. What comes out is astonishing stuff. A single barrel of crude contains roughly the same energy as a human being working without a break for 12 years. That is the trick, and it is worth stopping on. When you fill a car, you are pouring in the equivalent of several years of human labor, and it costs less than a meal. Nothing else in nature is like this. Coal is not like this. Coal is heavy and dirty and will not flow. Oil flows. It can be pumped through a pipe, poured into a tank, carried across an ocean, and burned in an engine small enough to hold in your hands. Humanity spent 6,000 years looking for something valuable and settled on gold, a soft metal that does nothing. All that time, it was walking over the real treasure and complaining that it made the ground smell. Because oil did not wait to be discovered. In some places it came up on its own. In Mesopotamia, Black tar seeped out of the ground and hardened in the sun, and people found it useful for about the same reason we do. It stuck things together and it kept water out. They called it bitumen. They caulked their boats with it. They set their bricks in it. The ziggurats were mortared with it, and the walls of Babylon. There is a flood story from that region, older than the Bible, in which a man is told to build a great boat and seal it, inside and out, with pitch. The instruction is not a metaphor, it is a building specification. The Egyptians used it in mummification. The Chinese, by the 4th century, were drilling for it. Actual boreholes, hundreds of meters deep, using bamboo pipes and a bit hammered down by men jumping on a lever. They burned the gas that came up to boil brine and make salt, and then there is the weapon. In the 7th century, the Byzantines had something that terrified the entire Mediterranean, a substance they sprayed from bronze tubes on the prows of their ships. It stuck to whatever it touched. It burned on water. It could not be put out with water. Water spread it. Greek fire saved Constantinople twice from Arab fleets. And its exact recipe was such a closely held secret that it was eventually lost, taking the knowledge with it into the ground. For 4,000 years, then, oil was a known material with a handful of good uses. It waterproofed things and it burned things. Nobody thought of it as energy. Energy came from muscle, wind, water, and wood. That was simply what the world was, and it had always been that way, and there was no reason to imagine it could be otherwise. To understand what changed, you have to understand the problem oil solved first. It was not transport. It was darkness. For almost all of human history, night was simply lost. You could burn a candle made of animal fat, which was smoky and dim and smelled like the animal, or you could burn oil in a lamp, and the best lamp oil in the world came out of the head of a sperm whale. It is worth being clear about what that means. In the 18th and 19th centuries, one of the largest industries on Earth existed to send wooden ships to the far side of the planet for voyages that lasted 3 or 4 years, so that men in small rowing boats could harpoon the largest predator that has ever lived and cut open its skull and bail out the clear waxy oil inside it by the bucket. That oil burned clean and bright and without much smell, and it was the best light available. A big whale might yield 1,500 gallons. The industry killed hundreds of thousands of them. By the middle of the 19th century, the whalers were in trouble, not from conscience, from arithmetic. They had killed so many whales that they had to sail further and further to find any, and the price of light kept climbing. In 1,850 seconds America, a laborer might work a full day to earn an evening of good light. So there was a hunger in the world, and a fortune waiting for anyone who could feed it. Chemists began distilling lamp fuel out of coal and then out of the tar that seeped up in Pennsylvania. It worked. The product was called kerosene, and it was cheap, and it was bright. You could not build an industry on a few barrels a year scraped off the surface of a creek unless, of course, somebody worked out how to go down and get it. In 1857, a group of investors hired a man named Edwin Drake to do exactly that. He was not a geologist or an engineer. He was a former railway conductor in poor health, and his main qualification was that he had a free railway pass and could travel cheaply. They sent him to Titusville, Pennsylvania, and told him to dig for oil. Everyone laughed. Digging failed immediately. The holes filled with water. So Drake did something nobody had tried for oil. He borrowed the technique used for drilling salt wells, and he added his own idea. He drove an iron pipe down through the loose gravel first and drilled inside the pipe. The pipe held the hole open. It is a small idea. It is also the idea, and every oil well in the world still uses a version of it. He drilled through 1859 while the money ran out, and the locals called the operation Drake's Folly. His backers wrote to tell him to stop. The letter was in the post undelivered when on the 27th of August, at 69 feet, the drill dropped into a crevice and the crew went home for the day. The next morning, they found the hole full of black liquid. Drake had, in effect, invented the oil industry. He produced perhaps 20 barrels a day. Within 15 months, there were 75 wells in that valley. Within 3 years, the price of oil collapsed from $20 a barrel to 10 cents because absolutely everybody drilled and absolutely nobody could stop. That is the pattern, and it will repeat for the next 150 years. Oil is found, oil floods the market, the price collapses, the small men are ruined, and someone very patient buys the wreckage. Drake himself did not patent his method. He lost everything speculating on the market he created and ended his life on a small pension voted to him out of embarrassment by the state of Pennsylvania. The someone very patient was a young bookkeeper in Cleveland named John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller looked at the chaos of the oil fields and drew a conclusion that everyone else missed. The money was not in finding oil. Finding oil was a lottery, and lotteries ruin people. The money was in what happened afterwards, in refining the crude and in moving it. Every barrel from every well had to pass through a refinery. So he bought refineries. Then he went to the railways and pointed out that he could guarantee them a steady, enormous volume of freight every single day if they gave him a secret discount. That discount let him undercut every rival, and when the rivals were bleeding, he offered to buy them, kindly, quietly, and with the observation that the alternative was ruin. They called it the Cleveland Massacre. In 3 months in 1872, he absorbed 22 of his 26 competitors. By 1880, Standard Oil refined about 90% of the oil in the United States. Rockefeller, he built the pipelines. He made his own barrels. He owned the forests the barrels came from. He was, by a distance, the richest man in modern history at his peak. His fortune was worth about 2% of the entire American economy. In 1911, the Supreme Court broke Standard Oil into 34 pieces. This was intended as a punishment. Rockefeller owned shares in every one of the pieces, and the pieces, freed to compete, became worth far more apart than together. His fortune roughly doubled. Those pieces are still here. They are called Exxon and Mobil and Chevron and Amoco. The company was broken up, and it never really died. It simply learned to walk on more legs. Which brings us back to that hill in Texas, because Spindletop did something that Pennsylvania never could. Pennsylvania oil came out in barrels. Spindletop came out in a flood, and the flood broke the monopoly's grip. There was suddenly so much oil in a place Standard did not control that new companies could be born. Gulf Oil, Texaco's son. The Texas fields made oil cheap enough to stop being a lamp fuel and start being something else. Because at exactly this moment, 2 machines were arriving. The first was the motor car, which needed a light fraction of crude that refiners had previously regarded as a nuisance and sometimes dumped in rivers. It was called gasoline. In 1900, there were 8,000 cars in America. In 1912, there were 900,000. By 1930, there were 23 million. The second machine was the warship. In 1911, the First Lord of the Admiralty, a young Winston Churchill, faced a decision that terrified him. The Royal Navy ran on Welsh coal, which Britain had in abundance and could dig at home. Oil-fired ships were faster, needed far fewer men, and could be refueled at sea. But Britain had no oil. To convert the fleet meant staking the survival of the empire on a substance that had to be shipped from other people's countries. He did it anyway. He said that safety in oil lay in variety. And with that decision, oil stopped being a commodity and became the thing that navies are built around, and therefore the thing that empires are arranged around. Every map of the next 100 years is a consequence of it. Britain now needed oil of its own, and there was a rumor of it in Persia. A speculator named William Knox d'Arcy had bought a concession there in 1901, the right to search for oil across most of the country in exchange for a modest payment and a share of any profits. Then he began drilling in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, hundreds of miles from anywhere, with equipment carried in by mule. He drilled for 7 years. He found nothing. He spent his entire fortune and then borrowed against it. By 1908, he was finished, and his backers sent a telegram instructing his engineer, George Reynolds, to shut down the operation, dismiss the men, and come home. The telegram took weeks to arrive. Reynolds, receiving it, decided to be slow about complying. He kept drilling. At 4 in the morning on the 26th of May, 1908, at a place called Masjid Suleiman, the drill hit oil at 1,200 feet, and a column of it rose 50 feet above the derrick. The British government bought a controlling stake weeks before the First World War began. Anglo-Persian became BP, and the terms of that concession, a foreign company taking a country's oil and paying a small share for it, became the template for the entire Middle East. It is the arrangement that produced the coup in Iran in 1953, and the resentment that outlived it, and a great deal of what has happened in that part of the world since. An engineer ignored a telegram for a few weeks, and the 20th century rearranged itself around the delay. Then the world found out what oil really was, because it went to war twice to learn. In the First World War, a French official said that a drop of oil was worth a drop of blood. Paris was saved in 1914 partly by 600 taxis carrying soldiers to the front. It was the first war in which trucks, tanks, submarines, and aircraft mattered, and every one of them drank oil. The Second World War was, to an uncomfortable degree, a war about oil, fought with oil. Germany had almost none. Its answer was chemistry. Factories that cooked liquid fuel out of coal. An extraordinary process that at its peak supplied more than half the fuel of the Luftwaffe. It was never enough. In 1942, the German army launched its main summer offensive, not at Moscow, but at the oil fields of the Caucasus. And it was on that road that it walked into Stalingrad. In Africa, Rommel's tanks stopped, repeatedly, for the plainest reason: there is no fuel. In the Atlantic, U-boats hunted tankers, and in the Pacific, the war began over oil. The United States, which then produced roughly 2/3 of the world's supply, cut Japan off in 1941. Japan had perhaps 2 years of reserves and a choice: withdraw from China. Taking them meant war with America. Pearl Harbor was, in its cold logic, an attempt to buy time for a tanker route. Japan got the oil fields. It could not get the oil home. American submarines sank the tankers, and by 1945, the Japanese Navy was fueling ships with a distilled pine root substitute and leaving them in port. The Allies did not win because they were braver. They won in large part because they had the oil and their enemies did not. What came after was the strangest thing of all. A world designed around the assumption that oil would always be cheap. For 25 years after the war, it was around $2 a barrel, year after year. And an entire civilization quietly rearranged itself to fit. Cities spread out because distance stopped mattering. The suburb is an oil product. So is the supermarket, which exists because refrigerated trucks can bring food from 1,000 miles away. So is the holiday abroad. So is the strawberry in January. And then there is the part nobody sees. Roughly 1/10 of every barrel is not burned at all. It is turned into things: plastic, synthetic fabric, paint, detergent, asphalt, aspirin, fertilizer. That last one matters more than any of the others. The Haber process pulls nitrogen out of the air to make fertilizer, and it runs on fossil energy, and roughly half the nitrogen in your body arrives there through it. Without that industry, the planet could feed perhaps 4 billion people. There are 8. This is the fact that makes the whole story difficult. Oil is not simply a fuel we are addicted to. It is structural. It is in the food, the clothes, the roads, the medicine. Everyone alive today was born into a world that was built from the ground up on the assumption that a barrel of ancient plankton would cost $2 forever. The assumption died in October 1973. The Arab members of OPEC, furious at Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, announced an embargo and cut production. The price of oil went from $3 a barrel to $12 in a matter of months. In the West, the effect was less like an economic event and more like a bereavement. Petrol stations ran dry cars queued for miles. Some American states rationed by number plate. The Netherlands banned Sunday driving and people rode horses down empty motorways. Britain went to a 3-day working week. Nothing physically changed. There was no war on Western soil, no factory destroyed. Some men in a room simply turned a tap, and the richest societies in history discovered that they were guests in their own economy. It was the moment the balance of the 20th century tipped. Wealth moved to the producers on a scale that redrew the map. The towers of the Gulf are made of that decision, and the consumers learned permanently that oil was not a commodity like copper. It was leverage. Every energy policy since is downstream of that order. So is the strategic reserve, and the fuel economy standard, and a good deal of the military architecture of the Middle East. The queue at a petrol station in 1973 is the moment the modern world discovered its own foundations by having them briefly removed. Today, the world burns about 100 million barrels of oil a day. Write that out. 100 million barrels. Every day. It is more than 1,000 barrels a second, and the number has gone up nearly every year of your life, including the years everyone agreed it should not. We know what it is doing. The carbon has been out of the air for millions of years, and we are putting it back over a couple of centuries, and the physics of that has been understood since the 19th century. The industry's own scientists modeled it accurately in the 1,970 seconds, and the models have held up well. And still the number goes up because of everything in this story. Because oil is not a habit, it is a foundation. Because a barrel does 12 years of human work for the price of a meal, and nothing else in the world does that. Because the alternative is not a different fuel, it is a different civilization, and civilizations are heavy things to move. 6,000 years ago, people were sealing boats with the black stuff that leaked out of the ground and thinking it was useful. They had no idea it was not useful. It was the closest thing to magic this planet ever produced. Sunlight, caught by plankton, buried for 100 million years, cooked into a liquid you can hold in one hand, containing more power than a man can generate in a decade. We found it, and we drank the lot in 150 years, and we built everything we have on it, and we have not yet worked out what happens next. That hill in Texas is quiet now. The oil ran out there long ago,